What's up, government class? You don't have to tell me. I can just look in a mirror. This quarantine mustache is killing it. Yesterday, we talked a lot about bureaucracy. That was really the main point of yesterday's lesson. Was talking about these various bureaucratic processes and positions. Just essentially looking at the question. I believe I don't believe, I know for a fact, we titled that lesson "How Presidents Govern," and we wound up talking a lot about that yesterday. So we didn't really get into the X's and O's of what the actual cabinet consists of, what departments, agencies make up the president's cabinet. So what we're going to do today is we're going through all 15 cabinet level departments. And I'm going to tell you what their mission is, when they were founded, notable facts, and essentially the format of each of those. So, yeah, we're going to talk about each of those cabinet positions. There are 15. I believe I just said that. Sorry, I had to pause it and walk away for a second. But within each of those 15, there are tons of departments and agencies and commissions and all that kind of thing. The federal bureaucracy is colossal. So we are definitely not going to try to memorize the whole family tree of these various agencies and departments, and then sort of the agencies that operate under those departments. Like, for example, Homeland Security. They recently, or not too long ago, absorbed FEMA, or the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So you have FEMA, which is its own entity, but that's operating under the umbrella of Homeland Security. So with that, this is a long PowerPoint, but the slides are very short. We're going to go through the PowerPoint, and then when we're done with that, if we have enough time, we're going to talk at greater length about FEMA, because FEMA, or the Federal Emergency Management Agency, they've been coming up and they've been very relevant as of late with these natural disasters and just all those kinds of things. So anyway, we'll look into that. I sort of want to do a deeper dive on that if we have time. So I'm going to X myself out so I can teach without being distracted by that cool mustache. And we're going to maximize that. And we're going to get going. So the President's Cabinet, Bureaucracy, Part 2. This is what the cabinet looks like today. Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, Attorney General, Department of Defense, Secretary of the Interior, Agriculture, Commerce, Labor, Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, Transportation, Energy, Education, Veterans Affairs, and Homeland Security. The cabinet in general, and some of this might be review from stuff we talked about yesterday, but the cabinet was established in Article 2, Section 2 of the United States Constitution. The idea was that they wanted to provide a source of key advisors to the president. Today, the cabinet includes the vice president and 15 executive departments. So here's a little primer. I'm going to give you a primer on the departments, and we're doing it in order of their succession to the presidency. So when this first was devised this idea of a cabinet, that makes sense to me. That it was basically trying to provide the president with additional eyes, additional advice on how to handle things. Usually, I mean, depending on what it is, the ultimate decision on a lot of most big things comes down to the president. But in a perfect world, he would be seeking counsel from educated and experienced cabinet members. I'm not sure that's happening, but that's the idea at least. We have the State Department. The State Department was originally established by the first Congress of the United States as the Department of Foreign Affairs. So it started out when it was formed, wasn't called the State Department. It's called the Department of Foreign Affairs. And that's back in 1789, July 27th, 1789. They changed the name less than 2 months later. And when Congress passed the act, they wrote that it was intended to provide for the safekeeping of the acts, records, and seal of the United States and for other purposes. That's a pretty broad mission statement, for other purposes, but hopefully you get the idea. The first secretary was Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, under Washington, so during the first presidency, served as minister to France. Eventually, he resigns because the United States, if you guys remember from U.S. history, or I suppose you'll be taking that as seniors, but maybe you remember from a previous history class or from when we were talking about the foundations of American democracy. One of the big conundrums that Washington and his successors faced was, how do you handle conflicts between Britain and France? Of course, we had just fought a war against Britain, but the fact is, we had a lot of economic ties with them, and a lot of Americans still felt a certain loyalty to England. The French, on the other hand, they had been rivals as well, but they had just helped us big time in the American Revolution, and we traded with them. So here, the U.S., the new kid on the block, just arrived on the scene as a sovereign nation, and like the first thing they have to do is decide how to approach this tricky international dispute. Washington, remember, who had some success during the French and Indian War. So he started out fighting against the French. And then, of course, he became a national hero during the American Revolution. So Washington had fought against both nations. And when we talked about political philosophy last week, or it may have been the week before that, we talked about how Washington, his big thing was staying out of what he called foreign entanglements. So he wanted us to remain neutral. The mission of the State Department is to develop foreign policy, advance freedom, and create a secure and beneficial world for the American people and the international community. And just in terms of notable facts about the State Department, there are 6 men: Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, Martin Van Buren, and James Buchanan, that served as Secretary of State and then became president. That's a big number. And those are especially older guys, where I suppose the talent pool of prominent politicians was smaller than it is now, but still, that's a lot. That's 6 U.S. presidents that first served in the State Department. or if not first served in the State Department, served in the State Department at some point before they became president. Next is the Department of the Treasury. The mission of the Treasury is to collect revenue, produce money, and formulate economic policy. Collect revenue, the Internal Revenue Service or the IRS. If you guys don't know what they do, I'm sure your parents do. They're the ones that collect our taxes. They produce money. So the Treasury is actually making dollars, and they formulate economic policy. The Secretary of the Treasury right now is a guy named Steve Mnuchin. And he's been criticized for some of his policy decisions, but the fact is he's in charge of the department that's in charge of economic policy. Now, does that mean Mnuchin can act unilaterally and do whatever he wants? No, absolutely not. But he is the figurehead and he's the boss of that department. It was also established in the First Continental Congress, the first United States Congress in 1789. So you can tell that the founding fathers placed a high importance on these things. They're addressing these issues in their very first congressional sessions. First secretary was a man named Alexander Hamilton. Maybe you've heard of him. So he's Secretary of the Treasury under Washington for 6 years, so 89 to 95. Excuse me, 89 to 95. And Hamilton's main task when he took office was to figure out how to get us out of debt, or specifically how to pay off our massive war debt. The war established us as an independent nation. Now, being able to pay back our lenders is just another step for the United States to take to further establish ourselves as a legitimate world power. If you remember from our lessons yesterday and the day before, and then at the beginning of the year, it's actually Hamilton that has helped establish the first bank. Eventually, Hamilton actually resigns to join the New York bar. And he wasn't going to drink beer as being a lawyer. Because the Secretary of the Treasury didn't make enough money for him. It's responsible for producing all of the coinage and currency in the United States. The Treasury building is depicted on one side of the $10 bill. Hamilton's on the other. Let's see. I feel like you don't see $10 bills that often. Oh no.